transhuman or trans...
Excellent. Well, thank you so much to all the organisers of ANPA, and my special thanks and love to Nicola Graves-Gregory for introducing me to your wonderful Natural Philosophy Association, and Andrea for making all the arrangements. And I'm speaking to you now from Canada, from my brother's family home, looking in front of me at the beautiful Okanagan Lake. And we've had some forest fires, but the air is, I can assure you, a lot cleaner than central London, if I can put it that way. So let's just talk about transhumanism or transcendence, and I take it you can all see my screen. There is a wonderful saying that between degrading superstition and still more degrading brutal materialism, the white dove of truth has hardly any room where to put a weary, unwelcome foot. Well, many of us realize that humanity is now at a critical juncture, even of bifurcation in human development and evolution. The Silicon Valley and World Economic Forum view of the human being is mechanistic. We are either complex biological machines whose software needs to be enhanced and upgraded, and in that sense we're all hackable animals whose behavior can be nudged or even manipulated and controlled, as was quite obvious during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the reductionist form of technocratic social engineering, where all life is seen as the product of matter, and its interactions and evolution is regarded as the enhancement of mechanistic attributes through technological development. And the goal of the future human or post-human is ever-increasing intelligence and cognitive abilities. This is the transhumanist stance. The spiritual or transpersonal view of the human being is that of an immortal spirit clothed in a mortal vesture. Evolution is regarded as spirit of consciousness, if you will, seeking ever newer and better forms through the cyclic shedding of previous outworn forms in order to express its limitless potentiality. The attainment of the fully human being is truth as love and wisdom. This is the transcendent message. So my talk is going to be as follows. I move this slide on. Our contents is going to be transhumanism and related cryonics, and I'll explain what cryonics is. Then we'll move on to transcendence and contrast the transhumanism and transcendence points of view. And then we ask, why does man yearn for immortality? Why does he yearn for it? So let's start with understanding what the transhumanist stance is. And it's important to do that because it's a very burgeoning, powerful, exponentially increasing international intellectual movement. So its historical roots, the historical roots are in the notion of eugenics and the notion of a master race. So it is a philosophical and intellectual movement which advocates the enhancement of the human condition by developing and making widely available sophisticated technologies such as genetic engineering, cryonics, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology to enhance cognition and longevity. And the fundamental ideas are closely related to eugenics, were first advanced in 1923 by the British geneticist J.B.S. Haldane in his paper Daedalus, or The Science and the Future, read to the Heretics Society, which is an intellectual club at Cambridge University. He predicted that great benefits would accrue from applications of advanced sciences to human biology. Now, the biologist Sir Julian Huxley is generally regarded as the founder of transhumanism, after using that title for an influential 1957 article. Although the transhumanism term actually derives from a 1940 paper by the Canadian lawyer and philosopher W.D. Lighthill. Now, Huxley was a leading member of the secular movement, arguing that humans should take control of their own evolution and enhance the human race by eugenics, the intention being to improve the human race and society by encouraging reproduction by people with desirable traits and discouraging reproduction by people with undesirable traits. Now, Huxley's solution was a new breed of genetically advanced children fathered by artificial insemination from sperm donors who would be men of long scientific lineage and high achievement in science and public life. And true to his word, he donated his own sperm as his contribution to the advancement of the human race. But we should also acknowledge that the Huxley family was very brilliant in its scientific and intellectual achievements, but also it had its fair share of nervous breakdowns and insanity and nervous disease. So, come on, the heredity laws apply as much to the mental as to the bodily faculties. And by the way, in those days, it was all down to men. You know, the women hardly played any part, and that was the age we live in. But this next slide summarizes what I've said. The two key influences, eugenics and the idea of a master race. Key influences were J.B.S. Haldane and Sir Julian Huxley. Now, who do you think proposed compulsory sterilization of the feeble-minded? Who do you think suggested in 1912 that compulsory sterilization should be in the early draft of the 1913 Mental Act? Well, this gentleman, whom we quite rightly revere, the young Sir Winston Churchill. And in Churchill's letter to Asquith, he says that the unnatural and increasingly rapid growth of the feeble-minded presents a danger to the human race which is impossible to exaggerate. So, is there another way, surely, of refining and evolving the human being? Surely there has to be. So the philosophical and intellectual ideology is entirely rooted in a personality-centered, egoistic concept of the human being as a biological mechanism. And according to a 2006 study by the European Parliament, transhumanism is the political expression of an ideology that technology and science should be used to enhance human abilities. But a machine can be controlled. So, as Yuval Harari, one of the top advisors to Klaus Schwab, the owner and chairman of the World Economic Forum, as Harari says, by hacking organisms, we gain the power to re-engineer the future of life. Because once you can hack something, you can also engineer it. Soon, he says, some corporations and governments will be able to systematically hack all people. And if we succeed in hacking people, he described this as the greatest revolution in biology since the beginning of life 4 billion years ago. Now, I'm not saying all this to frighten you, but we have to be aware of what's happening on the current political and scientific scene before we can deal with it. And related to all of this is cryonics, which is the process of freezing a dead body in liquid nitrogen. And this idea was put forward by Robert Ettinger, who founded the Cryonics Institute, and his book in the 1960s made quite an impact. After all, he said, would you not like to live forever on Earth? In the near future, this may become a real possibility. So the cryonics procedure involves packing the body in ice immediately after death, replacing the body, the water cells of the body with a kind of human antifreeze, and finally storing the body head down in a tank full of liquid nitrogen at a temperature of minus 196 degrees centigrade. And then when the supposed cure for whatever the cause of death was, including old age, the body would be defrosted, bringing the person back to life. The Alcor Foundation offers two options: a whole body preservation for a insurance policy of $200,000 in 2020, and what they call neurocriopreservation, which means just your brain and nervous system. And incidentally, cryonics has nothing to do with the ancient Egyptian procedure of mummification. There was no question in the ancient Egyptian philosophy of the mummy being brought back to life. So how do transhumanists and cryonicists view the human being, and how do they view life and death? Well, here's your typical robot man, and he's got a hole in the middle of his chest because obviously he has no soul. So their view of the human being is the physical body, dying is loss of physical function, and death equals brain death. Hence, extinction of cognitive function unless they can be enhanced. One of the most recent and very authoritative papers on the post-human being, the transhumanist pipe dream, I say, is this one by two famous Russian authors. And they present very detailed information on how to achieve immortality. And their 5-point plan to success is this: you resurrect the previous personality, and you solve the problem of identity. And the main players in all of this is powerful artificial intelligence powered by Dyson spheres. Now, Dyson spheres are, at the moment, hypothetical structures that you put around stars in order to capture a large portion of their energy. And this is all taken very seriously, I hasten to add and to emphasize, especially in Oxford University, where the James Martin Fellow, Anders Sandberg, is a fellow in the Oxford University Institute of Future Humanities. Julian Savulescu is the professor of practical ethics, by the way, in all of this. So what are the milestones on the route to success? Well, I'm hardly expecting you to read all the detail, but just look at the top here. We prepare the body, the human being when alive, cryonics freeze the body, plastination fill the watery content and fatty cells with a sort of plastic material, digital immortality and restoration from a digital backup. And when you've done all that, the immortality roadmap from 2015 is sort of guaranteed by 2021. There's plan A, plan B, plan C, and plan D. So you can see how seriously they take all this. And here is a summary. And we are confidently promised that they will colonize the galaxy, explore the universe, and solve the question of the end of the universe. Now, if one sort of read this kind of thing in a newspaper, say, one would say, oh, well, conspiracy theory and all those words, but this is taken very seriously in science, which is why I'm emphasizing this. Now, let us move on to something far more pleasant, transcendence. What is the metaphysical constitution and nature of man? What is the connection between the mortal and the immortal aspects of man? By man, of course, I mean the human being. I don't mean gender. And this is very important, the phenomenon of soulless men, how this happens in nature and its consequences and how it works out, and how spiritual seekers view dying and death. So in contrast to viewing man as a machine or hackable animal, let us remind ourselves of how man is constituted at all levels, from the physical to the spiritual, with soul as the interface. So the esoteric map of man, so to speak, is this. We are, of course, one organic, unified entity, but we present two aspects, the personality, the mortal aspect, the individuality, the spiritual being, the immortal aspect, which can further be fractionated into the well-known spirit, soul, and body. And we can look at this in terms of a fivefold division of the physical, the astral, the intellectual, the spiritual, and the divine. But in terms of consciousness, this column is very important. Atma, the divine higher self, by whatever name, the immortal spark, the spiritual ego, the higher ego, inner ego, and the lower personality here. The corresponding vehicles of consciousness, these are the centers of consciousness. The corresponding vehicles of consciousness are, of course, the physical body, the astral body, what's known as the Kama Rupa, that's the psychic vehicle after death, and then the causal and karmic body and the auric body. But the vital point I want to make is the importance of this word, antakarana. Antakarana is the bridge or the umbilical connection between the personal ego and the higher ego. It is the bridge between the animal and the spiritual natures. And just to make the point that this isn't just an artifact of some sort of esoteric science, we find this doctrine in all the great religions. For example, in the Zoroastrian religion, the Zarathustrian religion, we find the same teaching, the same doctrine about Dhyana, what they call Dhyana, the link between the lower personality, the lower quaternary, and the higher triad, the higher individuality. So without getting immersed in detail, the point I'm making is that the antakarana is that vital umbilical bridge between the personal nature and the higher nature. And let me illustrate this in this way. As I said, its role is a medium of communication. We can regard the higher self, the individuality, as the parent, so to speak, and the lower self, the personality, its child. Its function is it's a projection of the lower mind acting as a linking bridge or umbilical between parent and child. And the vital point is at death, it is a conveyor of all thoughts of a spiritual nature during the personal life that can be absorbed into the higher self. And it is only the spiritual aspirations that are absorbed into the higher nature. There is nothing of the personal life or personal desires that have any relevance. So by way of a little analogy, to the average person, the higher self is as the parent, and it always has to control the unruly personality, the child, and that control is through the umbilical connection, the antakarana. Let us regard the umbilical connection like an electrical conduit where the life force flows through all these little wires that are bundled together. Now, it stands to reason that the more noble our aspirations, the higher our thinking, the more altruistic our thoughts and attitudes and behavior, the more we will reinforce this electrical conduit. And by continually dwelling on the higher nature, we enhance this ability of transmission from parent to child, such that in the ultimate, so to speak, we have the sage, or the seer, or the genius, who is so imbued in his higher nature that he can produce great works of science, art, philosophy, and religion. But equally conversely, if we lead a life of selfishness, cruelty, criminality, to the extent that we do that, we progressively thin this umbilical connection, such that ultimately there has to be a complete break. Now, in the Eastern parables, there is the example given of the laborer, of the master who sends out his laborer to till the ground and gather the harvest. And he is content to keep the field as long as it can yield even the smallest return. But when the ground becomes sterile, then not only is it abandoned, but the laborer meaning here the lower self also perishes. So when that break occurs, we have the phenomenon of the Jekyll and Hyde and the soulless men. Now, for the average person, the Antakarana disintegrates at death, and its remains survive for a while. But Blavatsky, the great founder or principal founder of the Theosophical Society, mentions the Scottish novelist and poet and musician Robert Louis Stevenson, who certainly glimpsed a true vision in his Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde about the struggle between the good and evil that Dr. Jekyll faced, and how in the end his own good nature was overpowered by the evil in himself, which is a perfect allegorical account of the dreadful catastrophe resulting from the premature destruction of the Antakarana. So real-life examples in society during any epoch of human society are also, unfortunately, not hard to find, where we have the phenomenon of soulless men who are so cut off from their higher nature. So we find two classes of soulless beings on earth, and this is the high teaching of esoteric science, or occult science, if you like. There are two kinds: those who have lost their higher self in the present incarnation, and their fate is, the Sanskrit word is Avicii, if you like, the equivalent of Inferno in Dante's Divine Comedy, but that is only allegorical, of course. Avicii is not hell, as understood in Christianity. It is a state of the most dismal consciousness. Avicii means lifeless. The other kind of soulless being are those who have lost their spiritual connection, lost the antakaranic connection in this life. And the important point to be made is whether incarnated or whether hanging around as potent ghouls or psychic vestures, their influence on humanity is considerable. It is important to appreciate that extreme criminality has nothing to do whatsoever with intellectual stature. Animal cunning is not so easily discerned, though, since such persons can possess much charm and influence. And it is my personal contention that the extent to which a person displays cunning and manipulative characteristics, which is never to be confused with intelligence, is a measure of the extent to which such a person is an agent or an instrument for the working of dark forces. Now, the fate of the lower self and to humanity when it is cut off from the parent self can be this: because there is no spiritual connection, there are no spiritual fruits to reap in the after-death state, so there is a repeated incarnation and ultimately a more degenerate existence until the final disintegration. But also the spook, known as the karma manasic spook, the spook full of unspent desire and thought energies, becomes what is well known in the literature as the dweller on the threshold, and it infiltrates the new personality, and also it infiltrates the aura, so to speak, of human beings. And human beings of who don't really have control of their higher nature, their moral nature, and who are easily influenced by dark and malignant influences. So, in summary, when bereft of its guiding principle, the higher nature, but strengthened by the material elements, the lower self becomes, so to speak, an independent entity, and after suffering itself to sink lower and lower, it is immediately reborn and remains, or can remain, in an active state in the terrestrial aura, from which periodical descent to earth occurs at epochal moments in human history. Think of the descent of evil during the Second World War, and that will provide you with a clue. Now then, I'm not saying that all transhumanists have lost their souls. I'm hardly making such an arrogant statement. But what I am saying quite clearly and strongly is that the path that they are following, the path of degrading brutal materialism, can only lead them to discover the secrets of physical nature, and it can only lead them downwards in that direction which the great Blavatsky warns, where we are elbowing soulless men and women at every step in life. Let's contrast the transhumanism and the transcendence philosophies and look at the sheer fallacies in the transhumanist movement. The transhumanist idea of the post-human being is, as I said, a complex biological machine, and the goal is ever-increasing intelligence and cognitive abilities and immortality achieved through technology. Silicon Valley technology, genetic and engineering technology, or whatever. The superhuman is the evolutionary outcome of transcendence, where we realize, not because we are told, but we inwardly understand that we are immortal spirit clothed in a mortal vesture. And we understand life as spirit or consciousness that seeks ever newer and better forms through the cyclical shedding of previously outworn forms in order to express its limitless potentiality, in the same way that we cast off our old clothes and wear new clothes so we can better express ourselves through the newer and cleaner apparel. And the transcendence goal, of course, is the flowering of every human potentiality, truth, wisdom, and love, and it is attained by a qualitative evolutionary change of state from the ordinary present to a state of the superhuman being. Now, it's all very well to freeze a human body and say we can restore it to life, but let us just see the fallacies in all of this. The cryonics idea was started when the Russian scientists transplanted two heads onto one dog, and then Robert White, who was a devout Catholic, by the way, transplanted one monkey head onto the body of another. So, inspired by these animal experiments, we now have the case where quite a few people have decided to freeze their body and the head separately in the hope that the two may be united, or one may be united onto something else. So I ask, would the outcome of all of this be a blurring of the sense of self and an erosion of the unique distinction between a human being and a machine? And I ask, what is the driving force behind such frantic attempts to attain immortality? From where and from what level does it arise? Do other pieces of machinery, even computers, do they yearn for immortality? So we have a choice of two paths. There is the path of matter or the path of spirit, and the repercussions for humanity are immense, depending on which path you choose. The great book, The Voice of the Silence by Blavatsky, says the self of matter, and in capitals, the self of spirit, can never meet. One of the twain must disappear, because there is no place for both. So what do the self of matter and self of spirit mean? Recalling that matter is a generalizing term comprising a virtually infinite number of degrees of refinement from the gross to the physical, those who choose the path of matter, otherwise known as the path of the shadows, their motives are essentially matter-seeking, self-seeking, and any extraordinary powers and faculties are turned to personal gain for power and control. So when taken to extremes, they can certainly descend into what's known as the left-hand path. By contrast, relatively few are self-consciously following the right-hand path of self-renunciation and self-conquest, compassion and expansion of heart. These are known as the sons of light, and the divergence is clear-cut between the centripetal or self-centered characteristic and the centrifugal or expansive characteristic. That is why the above quote says, one of the twain must disappear. There is no place for both. There is a supreme logic to this, because attempting to walk both paths would be as absurd as trying to be both misanthropic and philanthropic at one and the same time, or attempting to cross a bridge, leaving one foot behind on the former bank. So to close down now, what are the repercussions for humanity? Man displays a very wide spectrum of consciousness. Here is another way of looking at our mind in terms of the great Plato, where he talked about the soul in generic terms that can either rise and ally itself to the spiritual nature, nous, the rational soul, or it can descend and display the characteristics of folly, the irrational soul. Here, we always give a helping hand to the fallen. Here, we trample on the fallen. And this displays the range from ineffable transcendence to unspeakable brutality, where we can identify all of these characteristics of the transcendent nature and all of these characteristics of the lower nature. And by way of two quotations to illustrate this, from her late Queen Elizabeth II, what a lovely saying in her Christmas speech. Everyone is our neighbor, no matter what race, what creed, or color. Contrast this with Our country has various weapons of destruction, and we will certainly use all means available to us. And I'm not bluffing. See the contrast between the two natures, and this is the point I'm trying to make. So to conclude, there cannot be even one single transhumanist who would not revolt at the idea of eating filth from the gutters. But these same people need to understand that hygiene applies as much to the world of physical matter as it does to the realm of the mind, and even more so. And that some of the latest ideas and experiments in science regarding transhumanism and cryonics are, as far as I'm concerned, the scientific intellectual equivalent of utter filth. Simple, even illiterate folk, and illiterate does not mean unintelligent, it means not educated. Simple folk who go about their ordinary lives devoted to their families, tending to the sick relatives, toiling in the fields, they are not so easily fooled by all this highfalutin intellectual froth, because they are more in touch with the heartbeat and pulse of life. They inwardly sense that a theory or idea in vogue that attracts the highbrows of academia or media does not necessarily make it the more valid or beneficial to life and society. And these ordinary folk may have no academic qualifications or scientific training. They may not have written erudite books or expressed their thoughts in eloquent language, yet they instinctively feel that hidden influences, mystery and magic cast their invisible spell over our lives and raise us from the rank of selfish genes and manufactured robots to the dignity of the gods. Here is one who truly raised humanity to the realm and dignity of the gods. This is how Mozart understood death. Death is transition. It is a transition to a fuller and higher life, as long as we maintain that connection between our personal natures and our higher natures, and reinforce that connection every day during our lives.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Any questions from either the Zoom or the live audience?
This is rich men going through the Isle of Needle, isn't it?
Sorry, what was that, Grenville?
I'm not sure I got the quote correct, but it's the concept of rich men getting through the Eye of the Needle.
Yes, that is a very, very apt quotation, and the trouble is, I'm just trying to see all of you and get back to gallery view. I'll stop sharing so I can see you then. The trouble with such quotations is when they become cliches, they lose their power. But it is really saying, very simply, as far as I'm concerned, there is that wonderful saying, die so that you may live. Now, what are you dying to? You're dying to your baggage, your possessions, your ideas, your materialistic concepts. So the rich man is not necessarily the rich man, dare I give a few names, they're pretty obvious ones. But it's the man who prizes his intellectual possessions as well as his material possessions, which have all got to be shed so that the new life may blossom. So it's a very powerful quotation, and I would like to send it to Mr. Bezos and Mr. Elon Musk as well, of course, if they even understood it.
Do we have any questions from the Zoom, please?
I think it says thank you, Eddie. I think I'm not as pessimistic as it sounds as if Blavatsky and you are, in terms of possibility of change. In a way, I suppose maybe it's important for me to hold that view that because one sees it, in fact, in like so many people who who become drug addicts and then actually turn themselves around. So I think my sense is that so I am an optimist. I believe in
Nicola, I totally agree with you. One has to be a long-term optimist, even though one can be a short-term pessimist. But these are relative terms. But if you just look around quite objectively at what's going around, look what one finds, look what one sees. There are wonderful beams of light and specks of light, and ANPA is certainly, without exaggeration, shedding such a light. And we have to remember the old saying, light a candle rather than curse the darkness. And if you like, one of Beethoven's favorite quotations from Merchant of Venice, Portia, saying, how far doth this candle throw its light into the darkness? So one has room for optimism, and also the human race is not at the behest and whim of scientists. There are higher influences and forces that are, so to speak, guarding the human race, but they will not interfere into our stupidities. And before that optimism of which you speak can blossom, there has to be a lot of shedding of baggage.
Yes, indeed. And who knows how it's all going to pan out, what we've got to go through. Definitely.
But I think it's very important to understand what's happening in science and understand it in some depth and detail before we can constructively criticize it or deal with it. And equally understand what the great sages since time immemorial have said about our human condition. And each sage, each prophet has always emphasized the need to educate character. They have never wasted their time and energy inventing business models, technological schemes, and all of that to improve the human lot. They were supremely practical. They understood the importance of the physical material life, but they understood that that is a product of the inner life. So the inner life has got to be attended to. And this is something that mainstream science has hardly any time for. Because there's so much glamour, there's so much money, Nobel Prizes and all of that involved in mainstream science.
Ulrich,
The inner life has no glamour.
Ulrich has a question from the floor.
Yes, it seems like there are two opposites. Are there any good ways of improving communication between the two opposites, or would that even be because you can, of course, look into yourself and you can change yourself and your behavior. But would it be, are there any ways where you can see that it will be possible to improve communication between the two opposites and thus make things better, basically, for everybody? No sounds. Cannot hear you.
Eddie, I think you're muted. Press the space bar, maybe.
Now, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, good. When you say two opposites, do you mean the higher self and the lower self, or between enlightened science and mainstream science? Because there are increasing number of scientists who are very enlightened and certainly waking up to the higher possibilities of science and understanding the potential dangers of taking materialistic science to its extreme. So which two opposites are you referring to?
I'm mostly referring to people as a person and not so much the science part. So if you have a person like Putin and his belief versus, something else, so you have this opposite in the world, and I'm interested in improving the communication from two opposites, if it's possible. So the end goal will be even better communication.
Well, one route would be more enlightened journalists, because journalism has tremendous power. But the journalists eat out of the hands of what the people want to hear to a great extent. But from a more personal point of view, the strengthening between of the higher nature is always achieved by exposing oneself as much as possible to nature, to great literature, to great art, great music, and great science. And to the extent that one does it oneself, there has to be an outpouring of that in one's wider circle. Another way of increasing the communication in a very definite and wonderful way is being done by the Galileo Commission of the Scientific and Medical Network, where the objective or the idea is never to knock science, which would be utterly foolish, always to honor and respect science, but to show that there are aspects of life and existence that science, physical science, simply cannot explain. So we talk of transcending science, not castigating it. So that's another form of communication. Another way of communication is to show with evidence the increasing number of cases of near-death experience, where it raises the question, does consciousness survive death? And the more these cases that are assembled and put together with care and academic rigor, the more it will strengthen the communication between the old guard and the new guard, so to speak. So there are very positive and good ways of communicating, which we can all engage with.
Yep. Thank you.
Can I point out, by the way, that we've only got a few minutes before we're thrown out of this building.
Yep.
And we have to switch off the computers.
Oh, right.
Anybody got anything to say? Because we got.
I was just going to say. Okay, I was just going to say that, of course, that was in the beginning of ANPA, because Ted Bastin's wife was able to do, various parapsychological
See you tomorrow.
And so that was part of the idea of ANPA was actually, well, is there a science that we can look into? So it's related to what you were saying about the Galileo Commission, basically. That's all.
Okay, thank you very much for that discussion, everyone, because we now must leave the building. Unfortunately, we have to leave at 5:30 every day. We have to switch off the computers first, otherwise we'll be in trouble. So can we thank the speaker and all the questioners and all the speakers? Yeah, we really have to stop.
Thank you, Andrew. If you want my slides, I'm happy to email them to you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
God bless.
Thank you very much.
See you tomorrow. À demain.
Oui, à bientôt.